Jax's revenge domain. We'll be operating independently from here. That was it. One sentence from Sloane Cross, and I was out of the meeting. No explanation, no technical review, nothing. Just a polite dismissal like I was some vendor who'd overstayed his welcome. I'm Brady Stone, by the way. 51 years old, and I've spent the last 18 years building the logistics system that keeps Steel Ridge distribution running. Not the pretty dashboards the executives love to show off, the real stuff underneath. The logic that decides which truck goes where, the routing that adapts when traffic hits, the failover systems that keep us compliant when the DOT shows up unannounced. So get this, Sloane had been at the company all of 8 weeks. Fresh Northwestern MBA, sharp suits, and this way of talking about digital transformation like she'd invented the internet. She kept using phrases like legacy systems and optimization initiatives, which is corporate speak for this old stuff has got to go. Let me back up a second. When Sloane first arrived, I figured we'd work together fine. New CTO wants to understand the systems, makes sense. But every time I tried to explain how something worked, she'd cut me off. Can you summarize this in bullet points, or do you have a high-level overview slide? She didn't want to understand the system. She wanted to package it. Here's what really got to me. She'd reference my work in meetings like it was some kind of legacy burden. We need to modernize our aging infrastructure, she'd say, or it's time to move beyond maintenance-heavy solutions. Meanwhile, that aging infrastructure was processing 2,400 deliveries a day across 6 states without breaking a sweat. You want to know how I built this thing? Back in 2006, this place was a disaster. I'm talking trucks showing up at the wrong warehouses, drivers sitting around for hours waiting for dispatch, pharmaceutical shipments sitting in 90-degree heat because nobody knew where the climate-controlled trucks were. It was chaos. I didn't fix it with PowerPoints. I spent 6 months riding with drivers, standing in loading docks at 4 a.m., watching where the real world kicked our pretty plans in the teeth. Every rule in my system came from actual problems. Missed handoffs, shift change bottlenecks, traffic patterns that didn't give a damn about our projected delivery windows. The system I built, it learns. A route gets delayed because of construction. It remembers and adjusts future schedules. A warehouse gets backed up on Fridays. It starts routing deliveries earlier in the week. When the FDA shows up for a surprise inspection of our pharmaceutical cold chain, everything passes because the system's been monitoring temperatures and compliance in real time. That history never made it into Sloane's presentations. To her, the system just existed, like software that materialized out of thin air and started working. She'd ask me how something functioned, but she didn't really want an explanation. She wanted a summary, short enough to fit on a slide. And here's the thing that really bothered me. She started changing the language around my work. What used to be called our critical platform became a legacy support function. My role went from systems architect to technical resource. Then she started using this phrase that made my skin crawl: internal asset optimization, internal asset transfer, internal asset continuity. She'd drop it into emails like it was nothing, but I knew what she was doing. She was redefining my work as company property instead of something I'd built and owned. That's when I realized this wasn't about modernization or efficiency. They didn't just want me gone, they wanted what I'd created, separated from the guy who actually understood how it worked. The follow-up email came an hour after that meeting. Professional tone, almost friendly. She thanked me for my historical contributions, confirmed my termination effective immediately, then added one final request. For continuity purposes, we'll need full delivery of the system architecture, control frameworks, and operational procedures. I read that line twice. She wasn't asking for documentation. She was asking for the heart of everything I'd built over 18 years. The routing algorithms, the exception handling logic, the integration points with our trucking partners, all of it. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair. You know what I thought? Not a chance in hell. But here's where it gets interesting. See, I'm not just some programmer who stumbled into logistics. Before Steel Ridge, I spent 8 years in the Air Force doing supply chain coordination. We moved critical equipment into combat zones where a delayed shipment could mean people died. You learn to think 3 moves ahead, and you definitely learn to cover your assets. When I first contracted with Steel Ridge back in 2006, I made sure the legal language was bulletproof. Full ownership of all system architecture source code and the operational infrastructure stays with me. The company gets licensed use only. They can use the outputs, but they don't own the engine. Most contractors don't think that far ahead. They're so eager to land the deal, they'll sign anything. But I'd seen what happens when companies decide they don't need you anymore. The smart move is to protect yourself before you need protection. Sloane was about to find out just how well I'd protected myself. My answer to her request was simple: not today. But they weren't going to take no for an answer. Oh no, not Sloane Cross and her shiny new MBA. The first real push came 3 days later. Transition assessment meeting, they called it. When a company brings lawyers into what should be a technical handoff, you know you're not dealing with a misunderstanding anymore. You're dealing with a plan. The meeting was Sloane, some compliance manager I'd never seen before, and an external attorney whose camera stayed just out of focus. Real professional. Touch that. They had slides prepared, always with the slides, breaking down my work into neat little boxes labeled modular, transferable, and self-contained. Here's what killed me. They weren't trying to understand how the system worked. They were building a case for why they didn't need me to make it work. Sloane did most of the talking, using phrases like knowledge continuity and risk mitigation. The lawyer threw around terms like intellectual property boundaries. Funny how those boundaries were suddenly unclear after 18 years of crystal-clear contract language. I kept my mouth shut and took notes. In the Air Force, we had a saying: when the enemy's making a mistake, don't interrupt them. And boy, were they making mistakes. After that meeting, my inbox exploded. Request for architecture diagrams, request for database schemas, request for administrative credentials. Every email ended with the same line: for internal continuity planning. That phrase right there, that's when I knew for sure what they were after. They weren't gathering documentation, they were taking inventory. They wanted to know exactly what they'd be stealing before they pulled the trigger. My responses stayed short and sweet. I'd reference the contract language, provide high-level overviews without exposing the real logic. The colder I got, the warmer their emails became. Classic power play. When you can't get what you want through authority, you try charm. Then legal contacted me directly. Not Sloane, not the compliance guy the law firm Steel Ridge had retained. They needed to clarify intellectual property boundaries, they said. Those boundaries had been clear as crystal for 18 years, but suddenly they were confusing? Right. Here's where things got really interesting. The next meeting, they stopped asking and started telling. The attorney talked about internal resource allocation models. The compliance manager discussed onboarding schedules for system administration. Sloane spoke like my role had already been absorbed into the company structure. When I tried to correct them, politely, professionally, the room went dead quiet. Not confused quiet, calculating quiet. That's when Sloane dropped the real bomb. Near the end of the call, calm as you please, she said they'd need full access to the source code repository and operational infrastructure credentials. Let me tell you something about the difference between source code and infrastructure access. Source code is like having the blueprints to a building. Infrastructure access, that's having the keys to the building, the alarm codes, and the authority to change the locks. They weren't asking to understand the system, they were demanding to own it. I asked her to repeat that request, partly because I wanted to make sure I'd heard right, partly because I wanted that demand hanging in the air where everyone could hear it. She didn't hesitate, repeated it word for word, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. That's when I knew we'd moved past negotiation into something else entirely. They were trying to take by procedure what they couldn't take by right. The call ended professionally enough. No shouting, no accusations, just acknowledgement that we'd heard each other. But after I hung up, I sat there feeling something I hadn't felt since my Air Force days. That cold clarity that comes right before a fight. They thought the process would protect them. Thought if they followed the right corporate steps, consent would become irrelevant. They were about to learn otherwise. See, here's what Sloane didn't understand about contracts. She kept talking about standard enterprise interpretation and modern business practices like agreements were suggestions that evolved with the times. That's not how contracts work. Contracts are frozen moments of mutual understanding. They don't care about your corporate vocabulary or your executive confidence. The contract I'd signed with Steel Ridge was written for exactly this moment, when someone with authority would try to replace consent with assumption. Every clause had been negotiated carefully, every term defined precisely. Full ownership of all system architecture, logic, source code, and operational infrastructure remained with me. Period. Steel Ridge got licensed use only. They could use the outputs, measure the performance, even complain about the results. But they couldn't copy it, transfer it, or build derivatives. And they definitely couldn't demand the keys to the kingdom just because they decided independence was more convenient than partnership. When I explained this during our next meeting, reading directly from the contract language, Sloane listened with this patient smile, like she was waiting for me to finish reciting the Pledge of Allegiance so the adults could get back to business. Her response? That may be the technical language, but standard enterprise interpretation would be that anything developed to solve business problems eventually belongs to the business. I didn't argue philosophy with her. I pointed back to signatures and dates. Contracts don't adapt to trends. They don't care what's standard or convenient. They care about what was agreed to when both parties had equal leverage. The room got quiet again. Legal exchanged glances. Someone muted their line to whisper off camera. Eventually, Sloane wrapped up with corporate speak about reviewing options internally and exploring alternative approaches. The termination notice hit my inbox that same afternoon. Effective immediately, no transition period, no acknowledgement of ongoing projects, just a clean corporate severance with the usual confidentiality language. I stared at that email longer than I should have, not because I was shocked, I'd seen this coming for weeks, but because of the timing. They really thought cutting my contract would force my hand, make resistance impractical. What they didn't understand was that my contract ending didn't change anything about ownership. If anything, it clarified the situation. They'd just fired the only person authorized to operate their most critical system. That was their first mistake. It wouldn't be their last. You know what happened next? They acted like they'd already won. The morning after my termination, internal emails started flying around celebrating Steel Ridge's move toward operational independence. Congratulations were exchanged, forecasts got optimistic, leadership patted themselves on the back for taking control of core technology assets. I didn't get those emails directly, but word travels fast in logistics. Drivers talk to dispatchers talk to warehouse guys talk to everyone. Plus, I still had friends in the company who were scratching their heads about the whole situation. So I sat back and watched. Didn't call anyone, didn't send angry emails, didn't do anything except wait. In the Air Force, we called this waiting game. Sometimes the best move is no move. From their perspective, everything looked great. The system interface was still running, dashboards loaded clean, status indicators stayed green, routes showed up mapped and ready. To someone who measured success through quarterly reports, it must have looked like complete victory. Here's what they couldn't see, the difference between an interface and actual control. See, my system was built with layers. The pretty front end that managers love to screenshot, that was just the display. The real work happened underneath. Routing logic that recalculated loads in real time, exception handling that fixed problems before anyone noticed them, integration bridges that talked to our trucking partner systems. Most importantly, all of that logic was protected by authorization protocols. The system would accept commands only from authenticated sources. And since I'd built it, I was the only one who could grant that authentication. They had the steering wheel, but I still owned the engine. Now, I want to be clear about something. I wasn't planning sabotage or anything malicious. The system was designed to fail safe, not fail destructive. If it couldn't get proper authorization, it would simply stop making new decisions. It would keep displaying the last known good data, but it wouldn't process new inputs. Think of it like a car with an immobilizer. The engine won't start without the right key, but it doesn't blow up the transmission just to spite you. The first cracks appeared around 10 a.m. the next day. Nothing dramatic, just minor inconsistencies that people initially blamed on human error. A truck showed up at Bay 7 when the system said Bay 12. A driver got duplicate route assignments, small stuff that warehouse managers figured they could handle manually. But here's the thing about logistics. Everything's connected. One truck in the wrong place doesn't just affect that delivery. It affects the next 3 deliveries, the dock, scheduling, the warehouse inventory counts. It's like pulling one thread in a sweater. By noon, the problems were stacking up. Drivers were calling dispatch, asking for clarification on routes that made no sense. Warehouse supervisors were manually reassigning dock space because the system kept double booking bays. Customer service started getting complaints about missed delivery windows, deliveries the system insisted had been completed on time. That's when people stopped trusting the green lights on their screens and started making phone calls instead. When logistics people stop trusting their systems and start coordinating manually, you know you've got a problem. The afternoon shift made everything worse. Fresh drivers logged in expecting clear assignments but got yesterday's routes. New shipments came in but couldn't get processed because the system was working with outdated inventory data. A refrigerated truck carrying pharmaceuticals sat in the yard for 2 hours because the system couldn't figure out which temperature-controlled bay was actually available. By 4 p.m., it wasn't minor glitches anymore. It was operational chaos. Here's what I was seeing from my side. Data streams had frozen sometime around 8 a.m. The system was running on cached information, replaying Tuesday's logistics plan on Wednesday's reality. Every hour that passed made the gap between the screen and the ground wider. My phone started buzzing around 3 p.m. First call was from someone in dispatch, number I recognized but didn't answer. Then operations called. Then a number I didn't recognize, probably management. I let them all go to voicemail. The emails started coming too. Quick check. Are you seeing any issues with system performance? Then, can you confirm whether any maintenance updates were applied to the routing logic? By evening, urgent. Please advise on system status immediately. Each message got more desperate, but none of them admitted what had actually caused the problem. They still thought this was a technical malfunction, not a consequences of their decisions. The real escalation came around 6 p.m. A customer, big pharmaceutical distributor, sent a formal notice about delayed shipments triggering penalty clauses. That email copied half the executive team and mentioned potential contract cancellation. That's when the tone changed from, "Can you help us troubleshoot?" to "We need to talk immediately." But here's the beautiful thing. They still couldn't bring themselves to say what they really needed to say. Nobody wanted to admit they'd fired the only person who could fix their problem. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that their operational independence had lasted exactly 1 business day. The final email that evening came from Dean Walsh, the board chair. Subject line, urgent discussion required. The message was short. Brady, we need to schedule a call at your earliest convenience to discuss system restoration options. System restoration options, not "we made a mistake." Not "we need your help." Corporate language right to the end. I read that email twice, then closed my laptop and went to make dinner. They could wait until morning. After 18 years of building something they'd tried to steal in 18 hours, I figured they could sit with the consequences for one night. Sometimes the best response to urgency is calm. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. They'd asked for independence. Now they were getting a taste of what independence actually cost. The next morning, I took my time with coffee and read the news before checking my phone. 17 missed calls and 12 emails, all marked urgent. The desperation was practically radiating through the screen. I called Dean Walsh back around 9 a.m. No point making them wait longer. I wasn't being cruel, just establishing that urgency was a two-way street. The conference call filled up fast. Walsh was there, looking tired. Sloane was present but might as well have been furniture, camera on, mouth shut, finance, operations, legal, even someone from risk management. When that many departments show up to a call, you know the problem's gotten bigger than anyone wants to admit. Nobody bothered with small talk. Walsh cut straight to it. Brady, we're experiencing some technical difficulties and need to discuss restoration options. I appreciated the directness, so I returned the favor. The system isn't broken, Dean. It's not responding because it doesn't recognize current operational authority. Fixing that requires restoring proper authorization, and that comes with conditions. The room got quiet while people processed what I'd just said. The system hadn't malfunctioned. It had done exactly what it was designed to do when operated without permission. I laid out my terms clearly. $850,000 emergency restoration fee, immediate written acknowledgement that all intellectual property remained mine, and a new contract with better terms, $285,000 annually instead of the previous $180,000, plus ironclad language about ownership that couldn't be reinterpreted later. Sloane couldn't help herself. She jumped in, calling it unreasonable and essentially extortion. She tried to frame my conditions as profiting from a crisis I'd created. Here's where I had to set the record straight. I didn't create this crisis, Sloane. You did when you terminated my contract and demanded system access you weren't authorized to have. These aren't threats. They're the cost of emergency restoration under your timeline. The room shifted after that. You could feel the energy change. Finance asked about implementation timeline. Legal wanted clarity on the acknowledgement language. Operations asked how long full stabilization would take. Every question assumed acceptance. They were already moving past Sloane's objections without actually addressing them. That's when Dean Walsh showed why he was board chair. His voice stayed calm, almost matter-of-fact when he told her to stop arguing. The silence that followed was heavier than anything the system failure had created. He asked me 3 questions. Were my terms final? Yes. Would restoration be immediate once executed? Yes. Were there alternatives? No. He nodded once and told legal to prepare the documents. Just like that, the negotiation was over. What struck me most was watching Sloane become irrelevant in real time. Her authority didn't vanish with arguments or confrontation. It just got quietly redirected around her. When updates were needed, they went to legal. When implementation was discussed, it went to operations. She was still in the meeting, but the meeting had moved on without her. The money transfer cleared by noon. I confirmed receipt, then walked over to my home office and powered up the control console. Not dramatically, not with any fanfare, just the way I'd done it hundreds of times before. The system had never been broken. It had simply been waiting. Data channels came alive first. Real-time inputs replaced yesterday's cached information smoothly, like waking up from a pause rather than recovering from damage. Within 5 minutes, routing conflicts disappeared. Duplicate assignments corrected themselves. Trucks that had been drifting off schedule got updated instructions before drivers even called for clarification. At 10 minutes, traffic flow normalized. Warehouse bottlenecks cleared in exactly the sequence I'd programmed years earlier. At 15 minutes, compliance indicators shifted from yellow to green. At 20 minutes, the dashboard showed full operational status across all regions. I joined the status call to confirm everything was running clean. Different group this time: operations, finance, legal. Professional voices reporting corrections across all systems. No celebration, just the quiet satisfaction of competence restored. Sloane was technically present, but might as well have been a screensaver. When the chair asked for updates, they went to other people. When next steps were discussed, she wasn't included. Her name stopped appearing on follow-up emails that afternoon. 3 days later, I got an internal memo forwarded by mistake. Where Sloane's name used to appear under the CTO title, someone else was listed as Interim Chief Technology Officer. Her removal hadn't been announced publicly, but it had definitely happened. That's how corporate accountability works, not with drama or public humiliation, but through quiet reassignment to irrelevance. The new contract offer came from a senior VP I'd never worked with directly. Professional tone, acknowledging my measured response under challenging circumstances. They wanted a long-term partnership with clear boundaries, expanded responsibilities, and significantly better compensation. When I signed the revised agreement 2 weeks later, it felt less like victory than restoration. The system was running properly, the ownership language was bulletproof, and the compensation reflected the actual value of what I'd built. Looking back, the whole thing feels quieter than people might expect. There was no shouting match, no dramatic confrontation. Sloane tried to take something that wasn't hers, discovered she couldn't, and got quietly removed from the equation. Sometimes justice doesn't announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it just waits patiently for reality to catch up with assumptions. The system's still running perfectly. The boundaries are clear and respected. And when people ask me how it all ended, I keep it simple. They asked for my system, and I said not today. That was enough.